Cognizant, a global consulting firm advising many of the world's largest organizations, just released an updated report on the impact of AI. And the headline is difficult to ignore. What they projected in 2023 would take until 2032 to unfold is already happening now. 6 years ahead of schedule. That alone should give us pause. Because large-scale shifts in how work happens are not supposed to accelerate like this. Not inside organizations built on annual planning cycles, budget approvals, and structured transformation efforts. And yet, here we are. Which raises a more important question. What is actually changing so fast? To answer that, we need to revisit a word most of us think we understand. Workflow. Inside organizations, workflow has come to mean something very specific. A process, a system, a sequence of steps that moves work from one stage to the next. That definition didn't emerge randomly. It was shaped in the late 1980s and early 1990s as organizations began digitizing work and needed ways to store, organize, and move information across systems. Out of that moment came knowledge management systems, ticketing platforms, approval chains, technology designed to bring structure and control to an increasingly complex digital environment. And over time, the word workflow became synonymous with something defined by systems and processes, something owned by the organization, not the individual. That framing has stuck. Even today, when most people hear the word workflow, they think about how work moves through software, how tasks are tracked, and how processes are designed at the organizational level. And while that understanding is not wrong, it is incomplete, because it overlooks a more fundamental reality. A workflow is not just something that exists inside a system. It is how work actually happens. When you shift your attention from the system to the individual, the definition expands quickly. Your workflow is how you write and respond to emails. It's how you prepare for meetings, search for information, move between tabs, take notes, and translate a thought into an output. Any activity that requires more than a single step, especially anything you do on a computer, is a workflow. The difference is that our individual workflows are not formally designed. They are accumulated, shaped over time by habit, by the tools that were available when you first learned how to do the work, and by patterns you've repeated often enough that they no longer feel like decisions. They become automatic, largely invisible, inherited, rather than intentionally constructed. And because they are invisible, they are rarely questioned. This is where the shift is already happening. There is a growing divide between individuals who have begun to examine their own workflows and those who have not. Some are stepping back and asking very basic but powerful questions. How do I actually do this work? Where do I spend time? Where do I switch between tools? And where could AI participate in this process? Not as a tool that sits outside the workflow, but as something that becomes part of it. As these individuals begin to adjust their workflows, even in small ways, they start to compress time. Steps that once took minutes or hours collapse into seconds. Transitions between thinking, writing, and executing become more fluid. The overall shape of their work begins to change, often without any formal change to their role or their organization. At the same time, others continue to operate within workflows that were formed years ago. They are still writing, searching, organizing, and producing in largely the same way they always have. The result is that two people can hold the same title, sit in the same function, and be evaluated against the same expectations, yet operate with fundamentally different workflows and produce exponentially different outputs. I keep seeing this gap play out in real time. I'm regularly in conversations with leaders who are deeply focused on workflows inside their organizations, how to optimize processes, improve handoffs, redesign systems across teams, all of which matters. But in those same conversations, there's almost no attention on their own workflows, how they personally write, think, prepare, decide, and communicate. And that is where the recent Cognizant report becomes more revealing. Because what the report is actually showing us is not just that AI is accelerating, but that workflows themselves are changing faster than the systems designed to manage them. This week, we explore one source, the recent Cognizant report, New Work, New World 2026, and 3 distinct signals that point to what's already unfolding. But before we jump into the signals, let me take a minute to introduce myself if you are new here. My name is Chris Schmelzer, and I serve leaders who recognize the need and understand that the old models of leading and working are no longer keeping up with the pace of change. Every week, I track the subtle signals that a massive reset is coming for what we refer to as white-collar work, and share thoughts on how to lead yourself and your organization through the age of accelerating change. Here are 3 stories from this week that point to this massive shift. The first point from the report. The timeline has already moved forward by years. Cognizant doesn't soften the language in their update. What we projected might take until 2032 to unfold is happening now before our eyes. Today, 6 years ahead of schedule. That statement alone reframes the entire conversation. But they go further. In the US alone, this could add up to about $4.5 trillion worth of labor, shifting from humans to AI. The technology, in short, is affecting more jobs, faster, and to a greater extent than we anticipated. But the most revealing part of the report isn't just the timeline or the dollar value, it's how the work itself is being broken down. Cognizant analyzes jobs not as whole units, but as collections of tasks, and what they found shows just how quickly the underlying structure of work is changing. 3 years ago, only about 1% of tasks were considered fully automatable. Today, that number has risen to 10%, just 2 percentage points shy of what they originally forecast for 2032. At the same time, nearly 40% of all tasks are now classified as partially or mostly assistable by AI, up from just 15% in their earlier analysis. That already exceeds their 2032 projection of 31%. This is not a marginal adjustment to a forecast. It is a recognition that both the speed and scale of change were, and continue to be, underestimated. What's important is where this acceleration is actually showing up. The report points to widespread, real-time adoption of AI across knowledge workers, not just through formal enterprise systems, but through direct use in day-to-day tasks. Writing, analysis, research, communication, these are not future use cases. They are current behaviors. When you look at this through the lens of workflow, the implication becomes clear. The disruption is not primarily happening at the level of entire jobs. It is happening inside the workflows that make up those jobs. A workflow is simply a sequence of tasks. And what this data shows is that a growing percentage of those tasks are no longer fixed. They can be automated, assisted, accelerated, or restructured entirely. Some steps are disappearing altogether. Others are being compressed, and a large and growing portion are now being co-executed with AI, which leads to a widening gap between individuals who are actively rethinking and redesigning their own workflows in response to these tools, and those who are still operating in workflows they formed 3, 5, or even 10 years ago. The signal. The disruption isn't happening to jobs. It's happening inside the workflows that make them. The second point from the report. Roles at risk of being automated by AI are changing significantly faster than expected. One of the more revealing concepts in the report is what Cognizant calls an exposure score. At a simple level, it measures how much of a role's work, its underlying tasks, can be automated or assisted by AI. The higher the score, the more exposed the role is to AI-driven change. But the more important insight isn't just which roles are exposed. It's which roles exposure scores are changing fastest. Some of the job groups that were already highly exposed in 2023 are now seeing the most rapid acceleration. Business and financial operations, management roles, office, and administrative support. In 2023, these roles had exposure scores in the range of 14% to 21%. Today, they have jumped to between 60% and 68%. And their velocity score, how fast they are predicted to become more exposed, is increasing at a rate of 4 to 7 points year over year. This pattern doesn't stop at mid-level roles. It extends all the way to the top. In Cognizant's original report, the CEO role was projected to reach an exposure score of 25% by 2032. That projection was based on AI's ability to support discrete tasks, activities like preparing financial documents, analyzing data, generating reports. Today, the CEO exposure score already exceeds 60%, not because the role itself has fundamentally changed, but because the workflows inside it have. The same is true across every role listed in the report, because exposure is not really about the job, it's about the tasks. And tasks, when connected together, form workflows, which brings us to what may be the most important and least visible implication in the data. The exposure scores are rising for everyone, but the rate at which individuals are responding to that exposure is not. Inside these same roles, two very different realities are beginning to form. There are individuals who are actively integrating AI into their workflows, intentionally rethinking how they write, how they analyze, how they prepare, how they decide. They are compressing time, removing steps, and fundamentally changing how work gets done. And there are others, in the exact same roles, who are still operating inside workflows they formed 3, 5, even 10 years ago. And because individual workflows are largely invisible, that gap is easy to miss until the difference in output becomes undeniable, which turns this into a very personal question, not about your role, but about your workflow. Where in your day-to-day work are you still operating as if nothing has changed? And where should you be rethinking how the work actually gets done? The signal. Exposure is rising for everyone, but the real gap is forming between those who are redesigning their workflows and those who are not. The third point from the report: the way work is structured can't keep up. Running through the report is a deeper shift in how work itself is being understood. Tasks that were once considered purely manual are now being re-examined. Many of them contain embedded thinking elements, activities like judgment, pattern recognition, decision-making, that AI can now augment. This is not theoretical. It shows up in small, practical ways. A task that once required interpretation now comes with suggested outputs. A process that once depended on experience now includes deep pattern recognition at scale. A workflow that once required multiple steps of human coordination can now collapse into a single interaction. Individually, these improvements look incremental: better consistency, reduced error, faster execution. But the report makes a critical point. When those improvements occur across workflows, across every role, every shift, every function, they compound. And when they compound at that scale, the impact is no longer incremental. It becomes transformative. This is where the report introduces a subtle but important observation. The line between knowledge work and labor is fading. That line existed because historically we assumed a separation was needed. Thinking work required human judgment, while execution work required human effort. But when AI can participate in both, supporting decisions while also executing tasks, the distinction becomes harder to maintain. And the place where that breakdown shows up first is inside workflows. And yet, most organizations are still structured as if workflows are stable. Their operating models assume that change will be gradual, that workflows can be redesigned in cycles, and that systems can be updated through planning, budgeting, and staged transformation. But the report suggests otherwise. Enterprises built for gradual transformation are already struggling to keep pace. Rigid planning cycles, long budget approvals, and fixed technology roadmaps cannot absorb capability shocks of this magnitude. At the same time, the surrounding systems, policy, training, workforce planning, are still tuned to older cycles of change, slower rhythms, clear role boundaries. But those assumptions are breaking, because as tools evolve faster and faster, people have to adjust in real time. And this brings the signal back to the same place as the rest of this newsletter. The constraint is no longer access to technology. It is the ability to adapt workflows fast enough to keep up with it. The signal. Work is changing faster than the systems designed to manage it, and faster than most individuals are adapting their workflows to match. The data in the Cognizant report is clear. What's less clear, until you deliberately look for it, is how this is already showing up inside your own work. Because workflows don't announce themselves. Contrary to popular belief, they don't sit in a system. They exist in the small, repeated sequences of how you actually get things done, which is exactly why they're so easy to miss. Most people have already done this at least once without realizing it. The first time you typed a question into ChatGPT instead of Google, something small shifted. You didn't change your role. You didn't attend a training. You just changed the step. And the output you got back was fundamentally different. That is a workflow change. And if you've done it once, you've already proven you can do it again, intentionally, across everything else. I didn't fully see this until I started breaking down my own workflows step by step, not at a conceptual level, but at the level of what I actually do. Take email. For years, my workflow was fixed. Open, read, interpret, draft, revise, send. Every message required a full cycle of attention, and I never questioned it because it felt like just the work. Now that same workflow looks completely different. Emails are summarized before I read them. Drafts are generated instantly. Threads are condensed into decisions. My role has shifted from writing to reviewing, refining, and deciding. The task didn't change. The workflow did. And the time required to move from input to output collapsed with it. The same thing happened in how I create. Writing used to be the endpoint. Now it's an input. A single idea becomes structured content, summaries, and video. What used to be a linear workflow is now something I can expand, convert, and reuse across formats. The work didn't increase, but the output did, and in how I think. Conversations, notes, and ideas are no longer static artifacts I revisit later. They are captured, analyzed, and surfaced back with patterns I wouldn't have seen on my own. Not just what was said, but how it was said. Where I was clear, where I wasn't, where I defaulted to assumptions instead of questions. None of these changes required a new role, a new title, or a formal transformation effort. They happened inside the workflows I am already using, which is where this goes one level deeper than most people expect. The real constraint is not access to AI. It's whether you can see your own workflows clearly enough to change them, because most of them are invisible by design. You don't think about how you write an email, you just write it. You don't think about how you prepare for a meeting. You just show up. You don't think about how you move from idea to output. You just move through it. These patterns were formed over years, reinforced by repetition, and at some point stopped feeling like choices, which means most people are not intentionally working. They are executing inherited workflows, and those workflows were designed for a different set of tools. This is where the divergence actually begins. Not at the level of roles, but at the level of awareness. The people who are moving faster right now are not necessarily more skilled, more experienced, or more senior. They are simply more aware of how they work and more willing to redesign it. That shows up in very practical ways. They don't start from scratch unless they have to. They don't move linearly through tasks that can be collapsed. They don't rely solely on memory when systems can surface patterns. They treat their own workflow as something that can be intentionally engineered. Most people don't. And that gap is difficult to detect because it doesn't show up in a system. It shows up in output, in speed, in clarity, in the ability to move from idea to execution with less friction. Two people in the same role can look identical from the outside and operate at completely different levels internally. For leaders, this compounds even further. Because leadership is not just decision-making, it is a set of workflows expressed through every conversation. How you ask questions, how you frame problems, how you respond under pressure, how you guide others through uncertainty. These are all patterns, and for the first time, those patterns can be captured, analyzed, and deep suggestions for improvement can be shared. Take something as routine as a one-on-one with a direct report. That conversation has a workflow. You just can't see it. How much you're talking versus listening. Whether your questions are opening the conversation up or quietly closing it down. Whether you're responding to what was actually said or to what you expected to hear. These patterns repeat across every meeting, every week, and most leaders never see them because no one is watching and nothing is being measured. Now imagine recording that conversation and running it through AI, not to transcribe it, but to analyze it. Where did the energy expand and where did it contract? When adversity came up, did your language widen the space for your direct report to think, or did it narrow toward your own conclusions? How many of your questions were genuinely open versus leading? What weren't you asking that you should have been? That's not a performance review. That's a workflow being made visible for the first time, which means leadership itself is becoming a visible, improvable workflow. The question is whether you are treating it that way, because nothing in your organization will move faster than the workflows of the people leading it. And right now, those workflows are either being redesigned or left as they were. I've been systematically documenting the workflows I've changed, where AI is actually compressing time, where it isn't, and what that looks like in practice across writing, thinking, and communication. Not conceptually, but step by step, and what tools I am experimenting with to do it. I'll be sharing that at the end of the month. If you've listening to this and realize you haven't been looking at your own workflows at all, then that's exactly who I'm putting it together for. Click the link in the description to add your name and email to the form, and I'll send it when it's ready. If this resonates, join us as we explore what it means to lead, live, and work in an era of accelerating change.